Meridian Prime had always marketed itself as the sophisticated alternative to crude planetary combat sports, which was rather like advertising a nuclear weapon as a sophisticated alternative to a regular explosion. The difference existed, certainly, but the end result remained disappointingly similar for anyone unfortunate enough to find themselves on the receiving end. The station's crown arena floated in the system's asteroid belt like a glittering testament to civilization's ability to package violence in increasingly expensive wrapping paper. Tonight's entertainment promised to be particularly educational for the assembled representatives of 17 different star systems, each of whom had arrived carrying their species' particular flavor of arrogance and enough credits to make their inevitable losses hurt in interesting ways. The venue itself was an architectural marvel that combined the elegance of Carathian crystal-growing techniques with the practical brutality of Venderian cage-fighting traditions, creating something that resembled a cathedral designed by someone with strong opinions about blood sports. The betting pools had reached levels that economists in civilized sectors would classify as aggressively stupid, which accurately described both the amounts involved and the reasoning behind them. The odds heavily favored Zephron Kraxx of the Valtharian hegemony, which surprised absolutely no one who had spent more than 30 seconds studying the accumulated wisdom regarding interspecies combat effectiveness. Valtharians, according to every military academy textbook in the known galaxy, represented what happened when evolution decided that the concept of overkill was for species lacking proper ambition. 8.5 feet of crystalline scale perfection, built along the lines of what would happen if someone asked a particularly violent engineer to design the ideal predator, and then provided unlimited funding for the project. Standing in the opposite corner, representing everything the galaxy found charmingly naive about human optimism, was a female member of Earth's diplomatic security detail whose name the arena's announcement system had given up trying to pronounce correctly. This was partly because she hadn't provided her actual name to the registration system, but mostly because Valtharian vocal anatomy wasn't designed to handle the subtle linguistic differences between classified and go ask someone who cares. The human appeared to be using her pre-fight preparation time to examine the arena's structural engineering with the sort of professional interest that most spectators reserved for the complimentary beverages. She stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, which positioned her somewhere between Zephron's kneecap and his lower ribcage, depending on his current posture. Her build suggested someone who exercised regularly, but had never felt the need to advertise the fact through the sort of excessive muscular development that screamed, "I have abandonment issues that I resolve through weightlifting." What was most remarkable about the human wasn't her appearance, but her complete absence of the pre-combat anxiety that experienced arena observers had learned to recognize as the normal response to impending violent education. No nervous energy, no ritual combat preparations, no appeals to whatever deities might be monitoring sporting events in this sector. She simply stood there, waiting, with the sort of professional patience that suggested extensive experience with waiting and a philosophical acceptance that some things were worth waiting for. The Crown Arena's seating arrangement followed the galaxy's unofficial hierarchy with the precision of a diplomatic protocol manual written by someone with obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Valtharian dignitaries occupied the premium sections, their crystalline forms refracting the arena lighting in ways that suggested both beauty and casual menace. Carathian representatives lounged in their gravity-adjusted environments, their forearms gesticulating as they discussed the finer points of combat theory with the enthusiasm of academics who had never personally experienced violence more serious than a strongly worded peer review. The human delegation occupied what could generously be called seating, and what could more accurately be described as the section we had left over after everyone important made their reservations. This arrangement was both economically efficient and diplomatically insulting, though Earth's representatives had learned that complaining about arena seating assignments was an excellent way to find yourself excluded from future events entirely. Sometimes the art of galactic diplomacy involved swallowing your pride and pretending not to notice when your species was being treated like the entertainment equivalent of an opening act. None of the assembled dignitaries appeared particularly concerned about the evening's outcome. This was, after all, supposed to be a demonstration rather than actual competition. The human would display admirable determination, possibly manage to avoid complete humiliation for several minutes, and then succumb to the inevitable reality of Valtharian physiological superiority. The crowd would be appropriately entertained, credits would be redistributed according to established patterns, and everyone would return to their respective quarters, satisfied that the natural order of galactic civilization remained reassuringly intact. The only significant flaw in this perfectly reasonable expectation was that no one had bothered to inform the human that she was participating in a demonstration rather than an actual fight. Zephron Kraxx occupied his designated combat area with a sort of casual dominance that came from never having encountered a problem that couldn't be resolved through the direct application of superior physicality. His species had evolved on a world where the environmental pressures had apparently included design the most intimidating possible sapient life form as a primary selection criterion. The results were genuinely impressive from an evolutionary standpoint and deeply concerning from the perspective of anyone who might find themselves on the opposite side of a disagreement. His head resembled what would happen if someone crossed a classical dragon with a particularly irritated geometric crystal, complete with facial features that suggested both intelligence and an unfortunate tendency toward violence as a first resort for conflict resolution. His torso was constructed along the principles of advanced military engineering, combining maximum structural integrity with optimal force projection capabilities. His arms terminated in hands that could crush most metals and had been doing so recreationally since childhood. Most importantly, from the perspective of the betting algorithms, Zephron possessed the sort of absolute confidence that came from 47 consecutive victories and 0 defeats. His combat record read like a catalogue of species that had learned, too late, that challenging Valtharian champions was an excellent way to discover the upper limits of their medical insurance coverage. The arena's announcement system activated with a sort of theatrical flourish that made professional entertainers consider alternative career paths. The announcer, a Carathian whose forearms allowed him to simultaneously operate the audio equipment, gesture dramatically, calculate betting odds, and scratch anatomical locations that would have been impossible for most species to reach, began his introduction with practiced enthusiasm. Distinguished beings of the galaxy, his amplified voice echoed through the arena with the sort of artificial grandeur that officials developed when they wanted to sound important. Tonight we witness an instructional demonstration between Valtharian combat excellence and human enthusiasm. The crowd's response was politely appreciative, but not particularly energetic. Everyone understood the script. The only real questions were how long the educational process would take and whether the human would manage to provide sufficient entertainment value to justify the admission prices. The mathematical models suggested not very long and probably not, respectively. Zephron acknowledged his introduction with a vocalization that combined the best aspects of a war cry, a threat display, and a sonic weapon test. It was the sort of sound that evolution had spent millions of years perfecting for the specific purpose of convincing other life forms that their current location was insufficiently distant from the source of the noise. The human's acknowledgement consisted of a brief nod that suggested she was paying attention, but found the vocal demonstration only mildly interesting. This reaction fell somewhere between deeply foolish and supremely confident on the standard scale of pre-combat psychological assessment, causing minor fluctuations in the betting algorithms as a few observant spectators noted the discrepancy between expected human behavior and actual human behavior. Combat participants, the announcer continued, his voice carrying the sort of official gravity that bureaucrats developed when they wanted to sound both important and legally protected. The engagement rules are elegantly simple. No external weapons beyond your natural biological capabilities. No outside assistance from technology, allies, or convenient acts of divine intervention. Combat continues until one participant yields, loses consciousness, or achieves that special state known as no longer meeting the technical definition of alive. The final condition was delivered with a sort of casual humor that indicated the announcer had witnessed enough arena events to develop a somewhat flexible attitude toward participant mortality rates. The facility's medical systems were genuinely excellent, but they operated on the philosophical principle that some forms of education required hands-on demonstration rather than theoretical discussion. May the superior evolutionary design achieve its inevitable victory, the announcer concluded, which was diplomatic phrasing that allowed every species present to interpret superior according to their own particular prejudices and anatomical advantages. The opening signal resonated through the arena with a sort of pure, crystalline tone that marked the beginning of officially sanctioned violence. Zephron immediately transitioned into what Valtharian combat academies called Dominance Projection Advance, a movement pattern that combined forward momentum with maximum psychological intimidation. The technique was designed to trigger instinctive submission responses in prey species and had proven effective against a remarkable variety of galactic fauna over the centuries. The human's response was to take a measured step backward and assume what appeared to be a standard defensive configuration. This behavior matched the combat prediction algorithms perfectly, and the audience settled in to observe the expected sequence of events: Valtharian superiority demonstration, human desperate defensive measures, eventual Valtharian victory, followed by medical intervention and updated statistical databases. Zephron's initial attack represented what military instructors would classify as defensive probe with educational intent. The strike wasn't designed to end the engagement immediately, but rather to establish range parameters and evaluate his opponent's reaction capabilities. The attack took the form of a crystalline clawed swipe that should have connected with the human's shoulder region, possibly separating it from the rest of her anatomical structure in the process. Instead, the human was no longer occupying that particular section of spacetime. She had relocated with a sort of fluid efficiency that suggested considerable training in the practical applications of not being present when violence arrived at her previous coordinates. The movement wasn't dramatic or showy, just professionally competent in the way that made experienced observers realize they were witnessing someone whose education had included extensive coursework in avoiding death through superior positioning. Zephron's second attack carried significantly more commitment and substantially more lethal intent. This wasn't a probe. This was a serious attempt to conclude the educational demonstration through the application of fundamental Valtharian combat superiority. The strike should have connected with centermass, delivering the sort of kinetic impact that would have folded the human around his fist like an origami sculpture designed by someone with anger management issues. Once again, the human demonstrated her remarkable talent for not occupying the same spatial coordinates as incoming lethal force. She moved precisely enough to avoid the attack, exactly far enough to clear the follow-up strike, and just sufficiently to make Zephron's extensive combat experience begin transmitting subtle warning signals that perhaps this engagement wasn't proceeding according to established patterns. The crowd's reaction was beginning to show signs of uncertainty that rippled through the seating sections like a slow-moving wave of confused murmuring. Humans weren't supposed to demonstrate this level of defensive capability. According to 17 different species military analysis databases, human reflexes were adequate at best, and their reaction times suggested evolution on a planet when nothing moved with particular urgency. The fact that this specific human seemed to be treating Zephron's attacks as moderately interesting obstacles rather than existential threats was causing some real-time revision of previously established assumptions. Zephron decided that subtlety was an overrated concept and launched into a combination sequence that would have qualified as a war crime in several star systems with more restrictive views on acceptable levels of violence. The series of strikes combined speed, power, and murderous intent in proportions that should have been sufficient to overwhelm any defensive capability that didn't involve heavy armor plating or divine intervention. Each individual attack carried enough kinetic energy to dent starship hull material, delivered with a precision that came from decades of professional violence application. The human continued her impressive demonstration of being consistently elsewhere when violence arrived at her location. She flowed around his strikes like liquid mercury around solid obstacles, never appearing hurried, never seeming desperate, just systematically occupying different spatial coordinates than the ones Zephron's attacks were designed to impact. More concerning, from Zephron's increasingly troubled perspective, was that she was beginning to move closer rather than retreating toward the arena boundaries. This behavioral pattern suggested either supreme confidence or complete psychological breakdown, and Valtharian combat doctrine included extensive protocols for dealing with both conditions. Unfortunately, those protocols generally assumed that confident or psychologically compromised opponents possessed comparable physical capabilities, which obviously wasn't applicable in current circumstances. The betting pools were displaying their first signs of serious mathematical instability. Several observant spectators had noted that the human's defensive movement patterns suggested formal military training, possibly from one of Earth's more specialized educational programs. This observation was generating concern because Earth's military academies had developed something of a reputation for producing graduates who were significantly more dangerous than their species' baseline statistics would indicate. Zephron's frustration was beginning to manifest in ways that suggested his legendary emotional control might be experiencing technical difficulties. His attacks were becoming more aggressive, which was impressive considering they had started at a level that most species would have classified as attempted homicide with autistic flair. The increased aggression, however, was coming at the cost of tactical precision and strategic thinking. The human appeared to be studying these changes with the sort of professional interest that suggested she was gathering useful data from the experience. Her defensive movements were becoming more economical, requiring less energy expenditure while positioning her more advantageously for whatever she was planning to implement when she finished her apparently comprehensive opponent assessment period. This was when several of the more experienced combat observers in the audience began experiencing the sort of gradually dawning realization that suggested they might have fundamentally misjudged the situation. The human wasn't fighting desperately to survive an overwhelming opponent. She was conducting what appeared to be a systematic professional evaluation of her adversary's capabilities, reaction patterns, and psychological profile. This was the sort of approach that military instructors taught to soldiers who expected to be engaging enemies rather than participating in sporting demonstrations. Zephron, meanwhile, was discovering that his traditional strategy of overwhelming opponents through superior Valtharian physicality was producing suboptimal results against someone who consistently refused to occupy the same spatial coordinates as his attacks. His extensive combat experience, impressive though it was, hadn't included preparation for opponents who treated his most devastating strikes as interesting but ultimately irrelevant phenomena. The human selected this moment to transition from passive defense to what military tacticians would classify as active problem resolution. Her first offensive strike was delivered with a sort of anatomical precision that suggested she had been conducting a detailed study of Valtharian physiology during her extended defensive observation period. The blow connected with a nerve cluster that Valtharian evolutionary development had apparently forgotten to protect adequately, transmitting signals through Zephron's nervous system that his brain interpreted as a polite but firm suggestion that perhaps he should reconsider his current tactical approach. The second strike arrived before Zephron's neurological systems had finished processing the first impact, targeting what appeared to be another undefended vulnerability in the supposedly perfect Valtharian combat architecture. This attack carried sufficient force to suggest that the human's physical capabilities had been significantly underestimated by everyone present, including possibly the human herself. The third strike completed what combat analysts would later describe as a systematic deconstruction of assumed physiological advantages. It was delivered with a sort of clinical efficiency that suggested extensive academic study of alien anatomy, possibly conducted under circumstances that hadn't involved willing research volunteers. Zephron found himself experiencing the novel sensation of being the recipient of violence rather than the distributor, which was sufficiently unprecedented to trigger something approaching panic in his higher brain functions. The human's attacks weren't just effective, they were precisely calculated to exploit structural weaknesses that shouldn't have been apparent to anyone who hadn't spent years studying Valtharian physiology under laboratory conditions. The crowd's reaction was shifting from polite interest to something approaching stunned disbelief that rippled through the seating areas like a slowly spreading infection of confused amazement. Humans weren't supposed to possess this level of combat expertise. According to the accumulated wisdom of galactic military science, they were supposed to be clever with technology, but hopeless in personal combat, creative with strategic planning, but lacking in physical prowess, admirable in their determination, but ultimately outclassed by species that evolution had specifically designed for violence. The human continued her systematic dismantling of these assumptions with a sort of methodical thoroughness that suggested she was working from a comprehensive checklist. Each attack targeted a different aspect of Valtharian combat capability, systematically removing advantages that Zephron had spent his entire life taking for granted as fundamental aspects of reality. His superior reach became irrelevant when she operated inside his defensive perimeter with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time learning how to fight larger opponents. His natural crystalline armor proved inadequate against strikes that targeted joints and nerve clusters rather than attempting to penetrate scaled hide through brute force. His overwhelming physical strength meant nothing when his attacks couldn't connect with an opponent who seemed to predict his movements before he made them. Most disturbing of all, from Zephron's rapidly deteriorating psychological perspective, was the human's complete lack of emotional investment in the violence. She wasn't angry, wasn't excited, wasn't displaying any of the combat emotions that Valtharian psychology recognized as normal responses to life-threatening situations. She was simply working, applying her professional skills to a problem that happened to involve systematically dismantling a significantly larger opponent. The arena's medical monitoring systems were beginning to register readings that suggested Zephron's vital signs were experiencing what technical manuals described as significant deviations from optimal parameters. His heart rate was elevated beyond normal combat stress levels, his breathing was becoming labored, and his body temperature was displaying the sort of fluctuations that indicated a biological system under severe distress. The human, by contrast, was exhibiting the steady physiological markers of someone engaged in moderate physical exercise. Her breathing remained controlled, her movements stayed fluid, and her heart rate suggested she was finding the experience mildly stimulating but not particularly challenging from a cardiovascular perspective. This was approximately when Zephron's legendary combat experience began providing him with tactical assessments that his ego desperately didn't want to acknowledge. The human wasn't lucky, wasn't desperate, and certainly wasn't weak. She was professionally trained, extensively experienced, and apparently quite skilled at the practical application of violence against species that had previously considered themselves superior in such matters. The realization arrived at roughly the same moment as the human's next attack, which targeted what Valtharian anatomy textbooks considered to be a completely protected nerve cluster located behind layers of natural armor plating. The strike connected with a sort of surgical precision that suggested detailed knowledge of alien physiology, delivering exactly enough force to convince Zephron's nervous system that perhaps consciousness was an overrated concept. His vision blurred into crystalline fragments. His balance systems reported multiple contradictory readings that couldn't possibly be accurate, and his higher brain functions began the sort of systematic shutdown that evolution had designed to prevent permanent neurological damage during catastrophic system failures. He remained upright through sheer species pride and stubborn determination, but his combat effectiveness had been reduced to approximately zero. The human paused in her systematic deconstruction, apparently waiting to determine whether Zephron had absorbed sufficient educational content from the experience to make the sensible decision regarding continued engagement. Her posture suggested professional patience rather than physical exhaustion, clinical assessment rather than bloodthirsty enthusiasm for violence. Zephron's response was to attempt one final, desperate attack that would have been genuinely impressive if it had been delivered by someone whose nervous system was functioning within normal parameters. Instead, it resembled the sort of uncoordinated movement that suggested significant neurological impairment combined with poor decision-making capabilities. The human's counterattack was delivered with a sort of biomechanical precision that would have made anatomy professors weep with professional pride. The strike connected with Zephron's jaw assembly, transferring kinetic energy through crystalline bone structure and cartilage connections with a ruthless efficiency that physics demanded and biology regretted. The sound of Valtharian dental work impacting the arena floor was audible throughout the facility, creating a delicate crystalline chiming that provided interesting acoustic contrast to the thunderous crash of Zephron's body following his scattered teeth toward the ground. The arena fell into the sort of absolute silence that occurred when fundamental assumptions about the universe were suddenly revealed to be catastrophically incorrect. The only sound was the gentle tinkling of Zephron attempting to locate his dental work while his consciousness slowly accepted that remaining awake was still technically an option, though perhaps not a particularly attractive one under current circumstances. The human stood over her defeated opponent with a sort of calm professionalism that suggested this wasn't her first experience with larger opponents who had made the mistake of underestimating her capabilities. She wasn't celebrating, wasn't posturing for the crowd, wasn't engaging in any of the behaviors that arena veterans expected from victorious combatants. She was simply waiting to determine whether the match was officially concluded or if additional educational measures would be required. The announcer's voice, when it finally returned, carried the sort of shocked undertone that suggested his prepared commentary hadn't included provisions for this particular outcome. Distinguished beings, we have an unexpected educational result. The betting pools were experiencing what economists would classify as total market collapse, which was a polite way of describing the situation when a large number of very confident people suddenly discovered that their assumptions about reality had been expensive mistakes. As Zephron gradually came to terms with consciousness and began the delicate process of distinguishing between his scattered teeth and random arena debris, the human collected her belongings and prepared to leave. Before departing, she looked down at the still-dazed Valtharian champion. "You're not actually a bad fighter," she said, her tone carrying the sort of professional assessment that instructors used when evaluating student performance. "You just made the classic mistake of assuming that because we're smaller and softer, we're not dangerous. That's the sort of assumption that gets people killed in real combat." She headed toward the arena exit, leaving behind a crowd of spectators who were frantically reassessing their understanding of human military capabilities, and a Valtharian champion who was learning that advanced dental reconstruction technology had improved considerably since his last medical procedure. The evening's entertainment had provided everyone present with a valuable lesson about the dangers of confusing physical superiority with combat effectiveness. As it turned out, spending your entire evolutionary history surrounded by things that were bigger, stronger, and more naturally armed than you were was an excellent motivator for becoming very, very good at killing such things through superior technique, better tactics, and the sort of stubborn determination that refused to accept physical disadvantages as permanent limitations. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to receive a comprehensive education in the difference between looking dangerous and actually being dangerous. One scattered tooth at a time.